Hi guys, I figured I would use the option for video recording of my answer this time, mainly just because I didn't have a lot of time to draft an answer and write it. So here we are. Um, I wanted to address the question, right? Do I feel, to what extent do I believe that comparative method and other comparative research designs can be value free and lead to morally neutral science? Um, in citing the reading in particular, I liked that we were able to see sort of those tables of comparative method and also describing pros and cons of small n versus large n. One thing that, and I'm going to pull that reading up to have it in front of me. Okay, one of the things that David Collier said in discussing the comparative method that I highlighted was that analysis studies are all based on values, and I do agree. Um, um, the synopsis that he offered was by Leipart was um, the approaches to criteria, how well they achieve the goal of testing a theory, as well as how difficult it is to acquire data. And what I sort of got as the gist is in order to sort of be value free is impossible. The researcher is the one selecting the data, and the data is only as I think as only as value free as the researcher um, makes it during selection. So, I mean, if you are trying to compare levels of democracy in various countries, the researcher is there then going to be selecting the countries in which to do the comparison. And so the data then that they are collecting based on those particular studies is going to be based on the value that they instilled in the theory in the first place. So now, um, as the lecture discussed, when we're talking small numbers of case studies, you can be more specific. You can really drill down if you're only comparing two things. But then what value are you getting out of comparing those two things? You're essentially drawing conclusions based on a small number of case studies. It compares that to more quantitative study, which is essentially taking a whole bunch of things and then boiling it down to the numbers to look for majorities and minorities and that sort of analytic research. And so while everything has value, right, taking that large N and getting everything to find, well, what's the most different versus something small and saying, well, what's the most similar? Um, you are then instilling your own value into the theory by simply conceptualizing that theory. Um, to be as neutral as possible, I feel like integrity of data is what needs to really be focused upon and defended, to where, like um, discussing or interviewing or getting anecdotal data may or may not be a really good idea during these sorts of studies, depending on the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Now, if you're like going into a country, let's say, you take a smattering of countries throughout Africa and you're trying to determine whether or not they feel like there is corruption in their governments, right? You can look at data, you can look at financial data, voting data, etc., that is less value based, but then you also can go and take anecdotal statements from people and talk to people about how they feel their trust is in their government system, whether or not they feel that there's corruption, and then you can use those two sets of data in order to come up with a conclusion. However, you're going to have some value and bias to the conclusion that you draw based on the fact that you're using anecdotal data. So to digress, um, I feel like no matter what sort of study you're using, the integrity is in the data and how value-based and or how um, um, you know, morally neutral the social sciences really depends on what and where and the researcher is collecting the data from. Is it pure numbers? Is it, and what source do those numbers come from? Has there been comparison? If there, is any controversy in the numbers? A lot of times, particularly like with what's going on right now and the US shutting down USAID, there's a lot of controversy surrounding um, the the value that we get from providing aid to countries where there is a lot of corruption. I actually have a really great book from my undergrad that I used a couple of times. Um, Let me find it here. I found it here, and it's by Pablo Yangues, and it's a really good book, Why We Lie About Aid, and it talks about the politics of why we offer aid in situations when we know that a very small percentage is actually getting to its intended recipients, where all of that uphill struggle is. And I really do recommend this book, particularly right now in the world that we're living in, because it talks about the history of a lot of these places and then the rationale. How is this connecting to what we're discussing? Um, all of this is based off of um, research into data. When you look at data and you say, oh man, only 20% of this aid is actually going to these countries because of all of the corruption, it's a waste of our time and resources. But if you stand back and you get some more data from a different source, you may find that even though it's only 20%, the good that it's doing is actually outweighing the fact that 80% of the funds are going someplace other than its intended source. So, can you separate value from rationale and data? Probably not. But the integrity of that data and the context of that data, that's what we need to be examining. So that's what I took from this. I don't know if that doesn't, if that misses the mark entirely, but that's sort of my synopsis. So thanks for listening.